Welcome to Plugged In, Exploring Energy, a podcast miniseries with Constellation, where we explore the evolving landscape of energy solutions. I'm your host, Chuck Hanna, Vice President of National Accounts and Solutions at Constellation. In each episode, we bring industry leaders and experts to discuss the latest innovations, challenges, and opportunities in the energy sector. Well, I'm really excited today to introduce our latest guest on Plugged In, which is Brian Janous, who's the co-founder and chief strategy officer of Cloverleaf Infrastructure. Welcome, Brian. I've had the opportunity to work with you for quite a long time. I know your background, been impressed in terms of how you've led the data economy, the sustainability transformation, and the overall energy markets, and we're really pleased to have you. But maybe to start with, give the audience a little more detail about your evolution in terms of how you got here, please.
Sure. So I've been in the power and utilities industry for about 25 years. I started my career in consulting for large C&I customers. That was big box retailers, municipals, large industrials. I started working with data centers around 2008. And my first data center customer, the first time I realized the data center could actually potentially be a large C&I customer. And of course, at that time, as you know, large was 5 megawatts, 10 megawatts, nothing like what we deal with today. So I actually started doing some consulting for Microsoft around that time. And then in 2011, they came to me and asked me to join full-time to start this energy team at Microsoft, which was very nascent, well, non-existent really. And it wasn't even clear to me why a tech company would need a person who knows something about energy, because certainly this was before the cloud was really taking off, or let's just say the very early days of the cloud. And at that time, I think Microsoft consumed a lot more electricity in its Redmond, Washington campus than it did in its whole global data center fleet. That, of course, is not the case today. Things have changed very much, and energy has really become an existential issue for these large tech companies. And so I got to ride that wave for almost 12 years of helping to build out Microsoft's global cloud infrastructure and then subsequently AI infrastructure. And then stepped down from that in the summer of 23 and took a little time off and ultimately decided to start my current venture, which is Cloverleaf Infrastructure, which is a powered land development company.
You've had a great run. And as I said, had a firsthand seeing you lead this transformation. So a couple of questions in terms of some of the points that you talked about. What do you see as the most urgent grid challenges that the utilities are struggling with now, and how other market participants like you and us and others can address those challenges and turn it into opportunities?
Well, I think one of the things that I talk to utilities about all the time is just the uncertainty around the demand. They're getting dozens, if not in some cases in excess of 100 different load requests from all sorts of different entities. Some of these are the hyperscalers themselves. Some of them are co-location companies. Some of them are the sort of proverbial two guys in a truck who have decided to become data center developers. And they're really struggling with understanding what is real and how do I differentiate from all this demand and have a demand forecast that I can invest against as a utility that protects my existing ratepayers and protects my shareholders. And so the chaos factor that they're feeling is quite high, especially for an industry that has not had load growth for something on the order of 20 years. So there's not really a muscle memory for load growth either. There's no one who's leading a utility today that has ever really experienced or at the helm of a utility that was experienced this type of growth. So it's just a new muscle for everyone in the utility industry to try to relearn.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see. And then, the other area that you've been very focused on is how to maintain reliability in terms of providing diesel backup generation from a reliability standpoint at these data centers to get the 5.9 levels that you've targeted. But you've also been focused in promoting other alternatives like natural gas and biogas. So how viable do you think some of these other newer technologies may be in the short term? And what's kind of the roadmap in terms of the longer term decarbonization plan while maintaining this high level of reliability? Like, how do you see that playing out over time?
Yeah, I think there's two things here. One is I think the dependence on diesel for this industry, well, it's coming to an end in the sense that when we were building 10 and 20 megawatt campuses, permitting 10 and 20 megawatts worth of diesel gens, having the fuel stored on site, having a contract to refuel that in the case of extended outage, was all entirely feasible. When you start talking about gigawatt scale sites, and not even just 1 gigawatt scale sites, but maybe multiple gigawatt scale sites in a region, the amount of permitting issues you have to deal with, even the idea that you could refuel that in a major emergency, it's almost zero. I remember during Winter Storm Uri, Microsoft or the grid was down where we were for something like 92 hours. And we were having to get diesel trucks from several states away to refuel. At the time was probably only a couple hundred megawatts of data center capacity. So now you take that times 10, and there are not enough diesel trucks that could possibly service something like a Winter Storm Uri. Like, it just wouldn't happen. So I think you have to be realistic about that. Solution doesn't scale at gigawatt level. We have to think about other alternatives. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time was thinking about natural gas, both from the emission standpoint being better, but also from a resiliency standpoint being better, because I could count on a pipeline more so than I could count on the diesel truck showing up. But it also adds an added layer of the ability to provide some sort of flexibility and dispatchability back to the grid, which is a critical issue for data centers to think about today. And so I think maybe the third piece is also when we were building 5, 10, 20 megawatt data centers, we were connecting those at relatively low voltage where the outage stats are higher, and therefore 48 hours made a ton of sense. I'm not convinced that you need 48 hours of backup if you're connecting to the 500 kV transmission system. Like the outage stats are very, very different at that level, but the industry keeps going down this road of we need 48 hours to get 5 nines. And some of this is just sort of groupthink, but it's not really tied back to the data. And one of the things we were really pushing on at Microsoft was thinking about optimizing that backup for the actual physical connection we had to the grid. You know, if we had dual connections to 345 or 500, that you probably can get by with 4 to 6 hours of batteries. That may even be overkill for a connection like that.
Interesting. So do you see some of these evolving technologies like biogas or other types of batteries as being an alternative in addition to these higher level voltage connections that you mentioned and the redundancies that could be built in from the grid, particularly given that those may not be available in the nearer term periods?
I think batteries definitely. Biogas is a little harder. I mean, I think the cost and getting to the sort of scale you need in that for that is maybe a little more challenging. But I'm very bullish on batteries as playing a significant role in providing resilience for data centers. And I think we will see more of that as you run into a wall in terms of being able to permit this stuff. And then you also start to realize that it's probably overkill anyway. So yeah, I really like the idea of using more batteries to provide that level of resilience to the site.
I want to shift gears a bit and then talk about Cloverleaf. And, you've been able to raise 300 million for projects. That seems like a really big number until you're in the data center world, which you know better than anybody. And when we see $25 billion investments now per data center, what's 300 million capital get you as far as development? And how have you been able to utilize that in your short period of time to do as much as you've done? Share your insights if you would.
Sure. It's a great question. So one of the things we're doing critically is we're not building data centers, which maybe should go without saying with $300 million, because, it's not going to get you very far building data centers. We are a pure play powered land developer. We do not build data centers. We will never build data centers. There's a lot of great companies out there that do that. And when we were looking at the landscape, the challenge we saw was exactly the thing everyone's thinking about, which is this is a power constrained industry. And the co-location companies today, historically, they've built their expertise around real estate and fiber. And if you go back and look at the leadership teams and their pedigrees and where they've come from, it's really been from those two industries. It's not been from the power industry. And so we looked at the market and said, where the missing piece is really someone that can sit in the middle to help orchestrate between the needs of data centers and the needs of utilities and grid operators and help bring solutions to the market that can accelerate time to power, but also do so in a cost-effective way that enables these companies, these end users to still achieve their sustainability targets. And so that's really the way that we look at the market: speed, scale, sustainability. We look to be a partner both to utilities and to data center operators. We're not trying to replace them. So our capital really is focused on land acquisition and also focused on utility contracting and engagement. So there's a lot of developers out there that will, go and put something in a queue and then have to say, well, I got an email from utility that says there may be some power there sometime in the future. We take a bit more of an active approach. We sign contracts with utilities for long lead equipment, for beginning development and planning work on easements and rights of way for new transmission lines. So what we really try to do is get to the point where we have a very high quality, high confidence power date where we can say this power is going to be delivered in December of 2027. And we can stand behind that with real contracts. So that then we turn to the market and say, hey, we actually do have power. Here's the actual contracts behind it that support, this delivery date.
Yeah, that's great value in terms of being able to sort through, work through all those challenges and make it power ready as you've described. So, we've seen some of your announcements in terms of what you got out there publicly, in terms of sites, development, and what you've done with those. One example I know is Wisconsin. I think you have a few others, but what's your scaling strategy in terms of your national approach? Is it regional specific, or how do you think about particular locations in terms of locating these first sites and then turning them into power ready data center sites as you've described?
Our approach, our underlying thesis is that we are going to be short power by 2030. The demand will exceed the available supply. And so anywhere where you can unlock dependable capacity is going to be valuable. Now, when I say anywhere, there are limitations, right? I do think that latency still matters. I think access to labor matters. These are extraordinarily large projects. And so we tend to pursue locations that are near major population centers that we can still access to sort of labor and still address some of those latency concerns. Because I think there was probably a period 18 months ago where everyone started to panic around power. And so then the thought was, well, let's just go anywhere. Let's go to West Texas. Let's go to North Dakota. Let's go anywhere. And there obviously have been developments there. I think, and I've lived these cycles before where in that panic, you start to compromise things that then later you come back and say, oh no, that's actually really important. We need that. I can't count how many conversations I had at Microsoft where we're sitting around and talking about, we did X, Y, Z, and someone will go, well, why did we do that? Who told you to do that? I'm like, well, you told me to do that. Remember 6 months ago, you said, this is so important. You have to go do it. And then later you come back and say, well, wait a minute. I got this other thing that's really important too, that I forgot about. Right. So I think latency is one of those things that is going to always be important. Now it's less so in training, if you're doing a training model, but even then I think you're going to have services that pop up out of those sites that will have latency considerations. And so, so we're really focused on a lot of times just creating new markets where we're not doing any work in Northern Virginia, for instance, or, some of these hyper constrained sort of markets. We're really looking at what are the secondary markets and new areas where we can find hundreds of megawatts, if not gigawatt scale. Our project in Wisconsin is a great example. We're 25 miles outside of Milwaukee. That's not been a market. The only other real investment in that market is Microsoft, which I was a part of when I was there. And we're seeing We Energies has been a great utility to work with. And so we were able to partner with them and the local economic development agency to put this site together. It's a 1,900 acre site. It has the potential to do 3.5 gigawatts by 2030, all grid connected, which would probably make it the largest site in the country by 2030. So yeah, we were really excited to get that one developed. Advantage Data Centers purchased that from us back in May, and they're off to the races.
Yeah. And that was very quick timing in terms of it seemed when you acquired that and then you were able to get it power ready and then turn it over to another data center developer to move forth. So very impressive work there. How do you think about the markets from a regulated versus competitive standpoint? You seem to work similar in terms of whether it's a vertically integrated regulated market or competitive market in terms of your approach. And it seems to be relatively seamless for you in terms of how you're able to work through those different markets. Do you have a preference for one or the other, or any other insights you'd share in terms of how you consider that?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that I've thought about, because I've been working in this industry for 25 years and over time had different perspectives of the advantages of a regulated, vertically integrated market versus a deregulated market. We've worked in both over the time, and Microsoft had data centers, all over the country and all over the world in different market structures. What's really unique about right now is that the commodity in question has changed. We're no longer buying energy, which is what we were buying for the last 20 years. We're buying capacity. So that changes the dynamic of how you think about market structures and how you operate in those markets. Because when we were building the cloud in the 2010s, we were doing so in a energy abundant world, or let me say a capacity abundant world, where whenever we call the utility and say, hey, I need another 100 megawatts, It was always just, okay, fine, I've got to order this stuff and it'll be here then and I'll plug you in and we're off. Now we're going. That's obviously not the scenario we're in right now. Utilities are having to contend with whether they actually have the capacity, either on transmission system or generation, to serve that load. There's generally plenty of energy. Like most hours of the year, there's lots of energy on the system. Easy to buy energy. It's really a lot harder to buy capacity. And so most of the sort of procurement muscle that exists at the big hyperscalers and at all large users are also energy focused. Like it's been, we're doing PPAs and we're doing all these, that's all energy, right? It's not really about capacity. So I think as it relates to regulated versus deregulated markets today, in some respect, it's actually easier to operate in a vertically integrated market because the deregulated markets haven't fully adapted to selling capacity as the commodity versus energy. And so, and this is when you and I have had this conversation around, as an IPP in a deregulated market, how do you position your portfolio then not to be about selling electrons, but rather selling capacity? And that's just a different muscle for everyone to sort of figure out. We recently ran our first capacity RFP with Level 10 and it was really just to do some discovery around, hey, could we actually go to the market, whether it's existing assets or development assets, normally that think about selling energy, to say, hey, you have this other thing that we actually want more than your energy, which is that capacity. Could we just buy that? Is that a thing that we could sort of carve out? And the benefit, of course, to the IPPs is that you actually create the potential, at least, for a more lucrative revenue stream under these long-term capacity contracts with end users, which don't typically exist, in the RTOs. I mean, you get 3-year, view with PJM, but if you had someone come to you and say, hey, I want to buy your capacity for 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, that could be really valuable, especially since you still have the energy revenue stream as well. So this is, I think, just a muscle that the deregulated markets have to start building. And there has to be a lot of education back and forth between buyers and sellers around, okay, how do we transact in this new world of constraint?
Yeah, as you've described this around how you're approaching it from a capacity standpoint, how that's evolved from the energy renewables that you did a lot of. And then I know other discussions you and I have had around enabling the growth of the market is around demand response. So when you describe all this, I'm starting to think of you as the money ball of the energy industry, where you're taking all these pieces and putting them back together and building this real competitive team from all that. So it's interesting to see.
It's an exciting time for sure. I mean, you've been in this industry a long time too. And this is the first time either of us have experienced growth like this. And it changes everything. It changes the dynamics of the industry. And that's why this industry has always been so much fun. I mean, it's just like every few years, there's this whole new thing to contend with that we hadn't thought about before. So it always keeps us on our toes.
So how do you see the future when you look at, you said like 2030 as an example, you see need for power, potential shortages. We've talked about the expectation of much higher growth or some growth, which, as you said, was well beyond anything we've seen forever. And then how does all the pieces that we've been through, those cycles you just were referencing, from a renewable carbon-free energy focus versus the capacity needs and the continued focus across many fronts in addition to cost, how do you see all that evolving between now and 2030? And what does your business look like? I know that's a pretty long-winded, deep question, but interested in your insights in terms of how you see things evolving and what your business looks like, call it 5 years into the future.
Sure. Well, at the industry level, I think there's kind of two ways this could go. One way is we just build a lot more gas plants. That everyone sort of looks at this problem and says, okay, the fastest thing to do to meet this capacity is more gas. We see more CCGTs, more peaking plants built. I think that's actually the wrong approach. And I actually think it's not going to be faster and it's going to cost more money and be less sustainable than the alternative, which is really focusing on how do we get the most out of the existing grid? How do we leverage things like grid enhancing technologies, storage as transmission, reconductoring, integrating more flexibility programs and resources and VPPs? That approach will be lower cost, it will be more sustainable, and it will actually be faster. It's very rare that you can get all three, right? It's always a thing about, oh, you can have two of these things, but not three. This is one of those scenarios where I truly believe a hyper focus on efficiency and leveraging the optimization of the existing grid. Now, of course, we're still going to have to build new transmission. It doesn't take off, they have to build a new transmission. But if we use those sort of things to bridge to that future of more transmission, that will be a far better outcome on every scale than leaning on the gas system completely. Not that we're not going to add new gas. We will. We definitely add new gas. But most of it should be peakers. we should not be thinking about this problem is going to be solved by building a bunch of new combined cycle plants. I just don't think that's the right approach. So our business is really focused on that other future, which is, hey, how do we, if everyone else is running around saying, hey, the only way to solve this is we're going to put big gas plants behind the meter of data centers, knock yourself out. I love when I hear people pitch businesses like that and say that's their business model, because I'm like, great, I'm not going to be competing with you. So like, it's fine. I think it comes from a misunderstanding of what the real problem is, which is, and again, it goes back to the fact that it's not an energy problem. And I think a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to connect this brand new like 24/7 load, so I need a 24/7 generation resource to match with it. So I need a nuclear plant, or I need a new baseload gas. And I was like, that's not how the system works. What you do is you connect this new load, which, oh, again, by the way, probably 90 to 95% of the time, there's ample power, ample energy to serve that. You're really talking about those periods of system constraint. And so when does the system start to strain? And then incrementally, what are the resources we can apply to that constraint, right? If I do a dynamic line rating deployment and I do some reconductoring here, and then I put in 4 hours of batteries, if I can do those three things and I solve that system constraint, that's going to be, again, a lot faster, cheaper, and more sustainable than saying, well, the only way to do this is to put a 24/7 baseload gas plant in. So I think the future really will be dictated by the degree to which one of those outcomes dominates. And I certainly hope it's the more sustainable, faster, cheaper one. I think everyone should hope that. But yeah, that's sort of my view of what's one of those two outcomes we'll see in 2030. And I think it's TBD as to which of those is going to be.
So I've asked you a lot of questions in terms of specific areas, but any other areas that you're focused on or on your mind that you want to share in terms of things that you're going to be a priority for you looking ahead?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the questions I always get is like, how real is all this demand, right? How, we see all these load forecasts, and there's no question there's double counting across utility systems. You can't take the sum total of all utility IRPs and get the answer. Nobody really knows. But I think what I do know is that it will, at least through 2030, be power constrained, such that if we can find ways to unlock more power, there will be demand for it. And so we're really focused on looking at that whole system and saying, okay, where are the most efficient, fastest, least cost ways to enable that power? And we think those projects are going to be super valuable to the market. Again, it's not that every megawatt that anyone produces is going to have demand, because there's other constraints, right? And there's permitting issues. There's, as we were talking about before, there's labor, there's latency. There's still going to be a hierarchy of demand around what really is valuable. And so I do think it's not as though you're just shooting fish in a barrel, where you say, well, I can go do anything and someone's going to find it valuable. I think that you do really have to deeply understand how the data center industry operates, what their constraints are. Data centers are really complicated machines. And there's a lot of sensitivities they have around the uptime, how they design them and how they operate them. And so you have to acknowledge that that is still a constraint that we have to deal with. And so in any event, I'm bullish on where this industry is going. And I think, I'm certainly bullish for your industry as well, that certainly the more innovative and flexible and adaptable utilities and IPPs, both vertically integrated and deregulated, are going to do extraordinarily well. And then it's a great opportunity.
I really appreciate your insights, and always appreciate the opportunity to listen to you, converse with you, and very grateful for, as I said at the beginning, being able to be a part of following you and be close with you in terms of leading the data economy, the sustainability, and the expected future growth of the industry. So thanks for being our guest today, Brian. And again, appreciate your insights.
Well, thanks for having me, Chuck. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
This is Deborah Channel from Smart Energy Decisions. We're really thrilled to have Constellation as part of Smart Energy Voices. I want to thank Chuck Hanna and the team from Constellation for making this miniseries possible. And as always, thank you to our listeners for being part of the Smart Energy Decisions community. If you enjoyed the episode, you can subscribe to the podcast on your preferred platform, and don't forget to tell your colleagues and peers about it too. To learn about how you can become part of our online and in-person content, visit our website at smartenergydecisions.com. We're always excited to share these presentations from leaders of the energy transition. We do that in this podcast, on our website, and at our events, and it's all in the interest of helping you make those smart energy decisions.